In late December 2025, near Pokrovsk, a mechanized column surged into an urban industrial zone, and everything shifted so quickly that even the crews inside the vehicles could barely process what was happening. Along the same stretch of road, a single choke point appearing at the right moment was enough to turn a moving formation into a locked chain of exposed targets. Up front, an Abrams roared like a mobile fire base, delivering suppressive fire to open a corridor for infantry to secure positions inside the industrial zone, where factories, warehouses, and basements can transform a cluster of buildings into a fortress. So where did the first choke point emerge? And why was it powerful enough to break mechanized momentum within minutes? And when an Abrams is pushed to the front as a suppressive anchor, where is the real line between a successful breakthrough and a tank overwhelmed by drones and stripped of mobility? Join military force as we break it down. Ukraine's mechanized group moves quickly on the approach road toward Pokrovsk's urban industrial edge, and the Abrams takes a forward position to apply direct pressure from the first minute. Reconnaissance drones hold a steady view above the route, marking likely firing points and suspected mine belts so the column can stay inside a watched corridor instead of guessing in the open. That overhead picture matters because the road is the fragile phase of the operation, and any forced pause can turn armored vehicles into fixed targets before infantry can dismount. Crew discipline becomes part of survival, since spacing, speed, and lane choice are now tactical decisions rather than routine driving. As the lead elements close the distance, supporting fires begin to work ahead of the vehicles, striking positions that could lock the entrance into the built-up area. The intent is to deny defenders time to set a firing line across the road. Drone feeds confirm impacts and reveal quick movements by defenders, which helps adjust fire and keeps the approach from turning into a traffic jam under observation. Armored carriers bring infantry very close to the first structures, and the dismount is timed to happen while the Abrams is suppressing windows, corners, and other points that survive indirect fire. Seconds matter at this stage because control of a doorway or a short line of sight can decide whether the group holds ground securely or gets pushed back into the road. Small teams move to cover gaps, secure corners, and deny easy angles, while radios and drone updates shorten decisions and prevent the defenders from resetting. The first minutes are often about safety drills, where soldiers check flanks, mark danger areas, and move in pairs so one mistake does not collapse the whole push. Right after the first dismount, the industrial zone becomes the focus, since warehouses, workshops, and basements create layered fighting spaces where a few rooms can anchor a defense. Early control of these structures also protects the route behind the lead vehicles, because a secured building can reduce the risk of close-range fires against the next wave. In this opening phase, the Abrams functions as a mobile firebase, whose value is measured by how reliably it keeps heads down long enough for infantry to establish a firm grip. Once that grip is set, command can shift from rushing forward to managing corridors, keeping supplies moving, and watching for the first counter-pressure. With that foothold formed, the next step is to see how the industrial maze shapes defense and counter-moves, and why both sides treat these buildings as the hinge of the fight. As Ukrainian forces established a foothold near the industrial edge of Pokrovsk, the fight quickly concentrated inside the cluster of factories and warehouses ahead. Infantry that had just dismounted now faced a dense grid of concrete buildings, loading yards, and internal corridors that limited visibility and slowed movement. Defenders used basements and reinforced walls to absorb incoming fire, then shifted positions through interior passages that attackers could not see from the street. Short exchanges of fire broke out around entrances and corner angles, where control of a single doorway could decide whether the advance continued or stalled. Each side tried to seize the first layer of structures, knowing that once the outer ring was secured, deeper sections of the complex would be harder to contest. Within minutes, the battle moved from the road into the buildings themselves, where distance shrank and every step required cover. Inside the industrial zone, the structure of the terrain shaped the tempo of the fight. Concrete walls reduced the effect of fragments, while upper floors provided elevated firing points that forced attackers to divide attention between ground level and overhead threats. When Ukrainian units secured part of a workshop or storage hall, defenders attempted short counter-moves through side corridors or adjacent buildings. These attempts did not require large numbers because even a small team reappearing behind a recently cleared space could force a pause. As a result, both sides fought in short bursts of suppression, followed by rapid movement to seal entrances and stairwells. The contest was not over open ground but over internal control, measured in rooms and access points rather than in meters. Any hesitation allowed the opposing force to re-establish a foothold and reopen firing angles toward the approach road. The industrial zone therefore became a rotating series of micro-engagements that determined who could hold the outer perimeter. As fighting intensified, it became clear that losing this complex would alter the defensive picture around Pokrovsk. Units forced out of reinforced buildings would have to fall back into lighter structures with less protection against artillery and drone-corrected fire. Without basements and thick walls, survival under indirect fire would depend more on movement than on shelter. That shift would also expose supply routes, since vehicles entering the sector would no longer have covered unloading points. In a battlefield shaped by constant aerial surveillance, reduced cover means shorter reaction times and higher losses during reinforcement. For this reason, control of the industrial zone carried consequences beyond the immediate block. It influenced how long each side could sustain pressure and whether follow-on forces could arrive safely. As long as the complex remained contested, neither side could claim a stable defensive line in this part of the sector. Earlier attempts to gain leverage near the same industrial approaches had already shown how quickly momentum could collapse. A previous mechanized push along the access route was identified by drones before it could deploy effectively into the buildings. Once vehicles were tracked on the narrow road, fire was directed at key points, and the formation struggled to maintain spacing. Without steady movement, the column could not enter the protective maze of reinforced structures in an organized manner. The result was a stalled approach that never translated into control inside the complex. That failed effort underscored a simple reality of this small campaign. Access to the industrial zone must be secured under observation, and entry must be synchronized with suppression inside. If either step falters, the attacker remains exposed on the road rather than protected within concrete walls. As the battle continued, the industrial zone stood at the center of events, shaping not only the immediate firefight but also the wider balance of the fight around Pokrovsk. Before Ukraine moved deeper into the urban edge near Pokrovsk, Russian forces launched a large assault along a road that ran close to a tree line leading toward the same industrial sector. The formation relied on armored personnel carriers carrying infantry, supported by additional armored vehicles, and small mobile groups on motorcycles and quad bikes. This mix of platforms was designed to combine protection and speed, with heavy vehicles forming the core and lighter units expected to close distance quickly once contact was made. The road itself appeared suitable for such an approach, since the trees offered partial concealment from ground observation and reduced exposure compared to open fields. However, the same narrow corridor limited maneuver options, which meant that once vehicles committed to the route, flexibility depended entirely on maintaining steady movement. The assault therefore hinged on rhythm, because spacing and timing had to remain consistent for the column to deploy effectively near its objective. As the column entered a tighter stretch near the tree line, Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles were already observing its movement from above. Continuous surveillance transformed the approach road into a monitored channel where every adjustment in speed and distance could be tracked. Drivers were forced to balance caution with urgency, since slowing down increased exposure time while compressing too closely increased the risk of collective damage. In practice, many vehicles followed the tracks of those ahead, narrowing the gaps between them and turning the formation into a predictable line. This pattern made the column easier to read from the air, because deviations became limited and routes were fixed. At this stage, the assault had not yet reached a point where infantry could dismount and spread into nearby cover. The vehicles were still committed to the corridor and dependent on forward momentum to reach a more defensible position near the buildings. Ukraine chose to strike before the formation could reorganize. The first decisive hit targeted a vehicle toward the rear of the column rather than at its head. This choice carried immediate operational impact because damaging the rear blocked the main path of withdrawal and prevented reinforcement from behind. Within seconds, the road that supported movement became a choke point. Vehicles at the front could not reverse safely, and those at the rear could not bypass the obstruction in the confined space. The formation, which had relied on steady forward motion, suddenly lost its structural coherence. Infantry began to dismount earlier than planned and moved toward the tree line for protection. While this reaction reduced direct exposure inside vehicles, it fragmented the planned sequence of the assault. Squads found themselves separated from armored support and from one another, and the original timetable for advancing toward the industrial area collapsed. Once the column stalled, the character of the engagement shifted rapidly. Momentum, which had been central to the assault design, disappeared as crews and dismounted soldiers focused on immediate threats. Without controlled movement, the formation could not transition into the relative cover of the reinforced buildings ahead. Instead, it remained exposed in a corridor already observed from above and increasingly vulnerable to follow-on strikes. The loss of rhythm meant that coordination gave way to instinct. Each unit reacted to local danger rather than to a shared operational objective. In a battle space defined by aerial surveillance and rapid targeting cycles, that change proved decisive. What began as an organized push toward the industrial zone ended as a disrupted formation struggling to stabilize under pressure. From the moment the rear was blocked and the choke point formed, the assault no longer followed its initial plan but unfolded according to the constraints imposed by observation and timing, and the outcome flowed directly from that disruption. The decisive shift occurred when an FPV drone, or small unmanned aircraft, struck a vehicle near the rear of the Russian column, creating an obstruction inside the narrow road corridor. The impact did not eliminate the entire formation, yet it altered the geometry of the battlefield within seconds. By hitting the rear instead of the lead vehicle, the strike blocked withdrawal and reinforcement at the same time. The road that had sustained forward motion became a trap that confined movement. Vehicles at the front could not reverse safely, and those behind could not bypass the damaged platform in the limited space available. With trees lining the route and few lateral exits, maneuver options collapsed quickly. The mechanized tempo that had driven the assault was cut at a critical moment, just before the column could transition into coordinated deployment near the objective. Momentum was replaced by congestion and uncertainty. In that instant, the character of the engagement began to shift from advance to containment. The formation was no longer a moving force, but a fixed reference point inside a watched corridor. Infantry, who had expected to dismount in a synchronized wave, were forced to leave their vehicles under pressure and seek immediate cover along the tree line. This reaction reduced the danger inside armored carriers, yet it fragmented the structure of the assault. Small groups moved toward trunks and shallow depressions, often without clear lines of communication to adjacent units. The separation weakened coordination between armored vehicles and dismounted troops, which had been central to the original design. From above, unmanned systems observed that the formation was no longer moving in sequence. Stationary vehicles and dispersed infantry created clear visual markers. Instead of tracking a flowing column, aerial observers monitored a confined cluster with limited mobility. That change simplified target selection and reduced the time required to plan additional strikes. Commanders inside the column now faced a reversal of priorities. Rather than organizing a forward push, they had to stabilize a stalled convoy under persistent surveillance. Radio traffic increased as units attempted to re-establish order under pressure. The assault, once built on speed and cohesion, had become a fragmented struggle to regain control. Once vehicles were fixed in place, they became reference points for indirect fire. Artillery units supporting Ukraine focused on clusters, particularly lighter mobile elements, such as motorcycles and quad bikes that depended on movement for protection. Shell impacts near these groups further reduced flexibility and limited options for organized withdrawal. The objective of this fire was containment as much as destruction. By placing rounds near likely exit routes, supporting forces narrowed the safe corridors available to the stalled column. Infantry who had taken cover along the trees found themselves pinned between damaged vehicles and incoming shells. Within minutes, the engagement had transformed from an offensive maneuver into a defensive effort to survive under layered pressure. Smoke and debris added confusion, reducing visibility and complicating attempts to coordinate a breakout. The sealed corridor became a confined battle space where remaining assets were engaged in sequence rather than confronted in open maneuver. When artillery effectively closed the area, drones no longer needed to search across a moving formation. They operated over a contained zone where vehicles and infantry were already constrained by terrain and disruption, and the assault unfolded according to the limits imposed by observation and timing. As the stalled column struggled to regain movement, Ukrainian artillery shifted attention to the lighter mobile elements clustered near the damaged vehicles. Motorcycles and quad bikes had been intended to exploit speed and maneuver, yet once the corridor was blocked, their advantage disappeared. Artillery fire landed close enough to disrupt regrouping and prevent coordinated withdrawal, even when it did not destroy every platform outright. The intent was to remove the possibility of rapid reorganization rather than to pursue total destruction at once. Without open lanes and forward momentum, these lighter units could no longer disperse effectively or reposition to support armored vehicles. The pressure forced surviving personnel to remain in limited cover, reducing their ability to respond as a unified force. In this confined space, mobility, which had been central to the assault plan, became a liability instead of a strength. Once artillery constrained movement, unmanned systems returned to address vehicles already damaged or immobilized. Drones no longer needed to search across a moving formation. They operated over a fixed set of reference points marked by stalled armor and abandoned platforms. Each remaining vehicle became a separate objective that could be engaged in sequence. This methodical approach reduced the chance that the column could restore cohesion or extract significant assets. As additional vehicles were disabled or set on fire, the assault structure eroded further. The visual impact of burning platforms reinforced the operational collapse already underway. More important than the imagery was the loss of coordination, since command elements could not effectively direct fragmented units under continuous observation. Time began to work against the attacking force, because reorganization required secure space and reliable communication, neither of which was available in the sealed corridor. The engagement shifted from an offensive push to a defensive struggle to preserve remaining combat power. While the stalled assault tried to stabilize, the side maintaining observation and fire control gained a narrow window of initiative. This window was brief, measured in minutes, yet it held tactical significance at the local level. Ukraine used the disruption to prepare its own movement toward the urban edge near the industrial sector. The challenge ahead remained substantial, since entering built-up terrain under drone surveillance demands precision and discipline. Armored support, including the Abrams, was positioned to suppress potential firing points and draw attention away from infantry establishing a foothold. The aim was not to pursue the retreating elements directly, but to convert their loss of momentum into territorial gain. In a battle space shaped by drones and indirect fire, advantage often belongs to the force that transitions fastest from defense to action. The rapid degradation of the mechanized assault demonstrated how quickly combat power can decline once mobility is stripped away. When Ukrainian elements later advanced along exposed routes toward the urban blocks, the decisive factor was not sheer numbers. It was the ability to cross mined approaches, endure persistent aerial observation, and maintain coordinated movement long enough to secure durable control inside the contested zone. The Ukrainian mechanized column advanced under morning fog, using limited visibility to close distance toward the industrial edge without immediate detection. Combat engineers moved at the front, clearing suspected mine belts along the approach road to prevent a sudden halt at the most exposed segment of the route. Mine clearance at this stage carried strategic weight, because a stalled vehicle near the urban perimeter would quickly attract renewed drone surveillance and corrected fire. Once a narrow passage was secured, armored carriers pressed forward to positions near key roadside structures such as a fuel station and nearby junctions that controlled entry into adjacent blocks. Infantry dismounted rapidly and secured these points, turning them into anchors from which further movement could be organized. Control of these access nodes limited the chance of a quick counterpush that could force the column back into open terrain. Throughout this phase, tempo remained central. The column had to move decisively enough to prevent defenders from reorganizing, yet cautiously enough to avoid overextending beyond its protective envelope. The first minutes inside the urban edge therefore became a contest of positioning rather than spectacle. During the consolidation phase, the Abrams provided direct fire against fortified positions that threatened the newly established foothold. High explosive rounds targeted strongpoints and upper-level firing angles, reducing the risk to infantry teams moving between structures. At the same time, the tank's visibility made it a primary focus for hostile drone operators. Persistent aerial attention increased the likelihood of a successful strike as the engagement continued. Eventually, the vehicle sustained damage that limited its mobility, a critical vulnerability in an environment shaped by continuous observation. A stationary tank in such conditions becomes a fixed reference point for additional targeting. The crew exited to preserve trained personnel rather than remain inside a compromised platform. Remaining vehicles were instructed to reposition once initial objectives had been secured, while infantry units held the captured ground. Images of the disabled Abrams later circulated widely, yet the operational outcome extended beyond symbolism. The episode underscored a central reality of this battlefield. Mobility, coordination, and sustained awareness determine survival more than the presence of any single platform. In this small campaign, holding terrain required both calculated risk and the readiness to withdraw assets when conditions shifted against them. The battle around Pokrovsk reveals a clear operational pattern. Control of aerial reconnaissance sets the conditions for road denial, and road denial shapes the effectiveness of artillery and follow-on drone strikes. The decisive moment was the strike against the rear of the column, which converted movement into congestion and forced infantry into fragmented defensive reactions. Once momentum was lost, the formation could no longer act as a coordinated unit. The industrial zone emerged as the central terrain feature because its structures offered durability and internal mobility that influenced the wider defensive posture. The role of the Abrams illustrated both strength and vulnerability. It provided critical suppression, yet attracted concentrated aerial attention once identified as a priority asset. Looking ahead, future mechanized efforts near Pokrovsk will depend less on numbers and more on timing, concealment, engineering preparation, and disciplined spacing. In this environment, rhythm and observation remain the true currency of survival. If you believe informed analysis matters more than noise, subscribe to Military Force for clear, grounded coverage of modern conflict. Here, the focus is not on spectacle, but on understanding how wars unfold, how decisions shape outcomes, and why the human cost should never be ignored. Stay with Military Force for responsible reporting, deeper context, and conversations that value knowledge as a step toward a more stable and peaceful world.